The fastest way to lose a fortune is to underestimate the person sitting quietly in your lobby. At exactly 9 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday morning, Ava Johnson stepped through the glass doors of Collins Strategic Group, one of the most influential consulting firms in Chicago. The lobby looked exactly the way powerful companies want it to look. Polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a reception desk large enough to make visitors feel small. Ava paused for a moment, taking in the scene before offering a warm smile to the receptionist. She wore a navy business suit, carried a leather portfolio, and moved with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years in executive boardrooms. "Good morning," she said. "I have a 9 o'clock meeting with Richard Collins." The receptionist glanced up briefly before looking back down at her screen. "Name?" she asked. "Ava Johnson." The receptionist typed for a few seconds, frowned, then typed again. "I don't see anything." Ava remained polite. "Could you check once more?" "It was confirmed last week." The receptionist shrugged. "Mr. Collins is very busy. You'll need to wait." Ava nodded and took a seat near the window. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Employees entered and exited the elevators while carrying coffee cups and discussing contracts worth millions of dollars. Several glanced toward Ava before quickly looking away. Nobody approached her. Nobody offered an update. At 9:45, a luxury car pulled up outside. A man in an expensive suit walked through the doors and was immediately escorted upstairs. At 10 o'clock, another visitor arrived and received the same treatment. Ava watched quietly. She didn't complain. She didn't demand attention. She simply checked the time on her phone and waited. Upstairs, Richard Collins stood in a conference room reviewing presentations. As CEO, he had built a reputation for making fast decisions about people. He believed he could tell within seconds who mattered and who didn't. While discussing the day's schedule, he happened to glance through the glass wall overlooking the lobby. His eyes landed on Ava. "Who's that?" he asked. An assistant looked down toward the seating area. "Not sure. She's been waiting for a while." Richard barely looked a second time. If she were important, someone would already be meeting with her. Then he returned to his presentation. Back in the lobby, an hour had now passed. Ava's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed the name of a Fortune 500 CEO. She declined the call. Moments later, another message appeared. Then another. Ava silenced the notifications and placed the phone back into her portfolio. She wasn't interested in those conversations right now. She was here for a reason. By 10:30, even some employees had begun wondering why the woman near the window was still waiting. Yet Ava remained composed, her posture straight, her expression calm. She looked less like someone being ignored and more like someone conducting a test. What nobody in that building realized was that every passing minute was quietly becoming the most expensive mistake Richard Collins had ever made. Around 11 a.m., the energy inside the building began to shift. Ava was still seated near the window, still calm, still waiting. The receptionist had stopped looking in her direction altogether, as though ignoring her long enough would somehow make her disappear. Employees crossed the lobby carrying laptops and coffee, moving with the urgency that always seemed to surround large contracts and executive meetings. Yet every so often, someone glanced toward the woman who had now been sitting there for more than 2 hours without complaint. On the 32nd floor, Richard Collins continued moving through his schedule. He met with vendors, approved proposals, and discussed quarterly forecasts. More than once, an assistant reminded him that there was still a visitor waiting downstairs. Each time he responded with the same confidence. If the meeting mattered, somebody important would have escalated it by now. To Richard, the situation seemed simple. Meanwhile, a young operations manager named Ethan Parker was reviewing the visitor log when he noticed the name Ava Johnson. Something about it bothered him. He had seen that name before. He opened several internal reports and searched through old meeting summaries. A few moments later, he froze. The name appeared in connection with multiple high-level discussions that had taken place over the previous year. Ethan frowned. The details were limited because much of the information had been restricted to senior leadership, but one thing was obvious. Ava Johnson was not a random visitor. He stood up immediately and walked toward Richard's executive assistant. "Who is handling the guests downstairs?" he asked. "Nobody right now," she replied. "She is still waiting." Ethan looked genuinely concerned. "Has anyone verified why she is here?" The assistant shook her head. "The CEO does not seem worried." Ethan glanced toward the conference room. He considered interrupting but decided against it. Richard had a reputation for disliking interruptions. Back in the lobby, Ava received another call. This time, the name displayed on her screen belonged to the chief executive officer of a major investment firm in New York. She let it ring before sending a brief message. A few seconds later, a reply appeared almost instantly. She smiled faintly and slipped the phone away. Nearby, a pair of employees noticed the exchange. One whispered, "That looked important." The other shrugged. If she were that important, she would not be sitting here. Ava heard the comment but showed no reaction. Instead, she quietly looked out at the rain falling across downtown Chicago. Her patience seemed almost unusual. Most people would have left long ago. Most people would have demanded answers. Ava simply waited. By 11:30 a.m., the receptionist finally approached her desk phone and called upstairs for an update. After a brief conversation, she returned to Ava with a practiced smile. "Mr. Collins is still unavailable. It may be a little longer." Ava nodded politely. "Thank you for letting me know." The receptionist seemed surprised by the response. No frustration, no anger, no complaint, just courtesy. As she returned to her seat, Ethan watched the interaction from across the lobby. The uneasy feeling in his stomach grew stronger. He could not explain why, but he was beginning to suspect that everyone in the building was overlooking something that would soon become impossible to ignore. By noon, the lobby had become noticeably quieter. The morning rush was over, and most employees had settled into meetings or offices. Ava Johnson remained in the same chair near the window, her portfolio resting neatly beside her. Nearly 3 hours had passed since she first walked through the doors, yet her composure had not changed. She occasionally checked her phone, responded to a message, then returned her attention to the rain-covered skyline outside. The longer she waited, the more unusual the situation seemed to the people around her. Ethan Parker could not stop thinking about the name he had found in those internal records. During his lunch break, he returned to his desk and searched again. This time he dug deeper. Access restrictions blocked some information, but enough details appeared to strengthen his concern. Ava Johnson had attended private strategy sessions with senior executives from several Fortune 500 companies. Her name appeared alongside projects involving acquisitions, investment partnerships, and long-term growth plans. None of it made sense. If this was the same Ava Johnson sitting downstairs, she should not have been waiting in a lobby for hours. Ethan considered going directly to Richard Collins, but before he could make a decision, another development caught his attention. A black SUV pulled up outside the building. A well-dressed man stepped out, entered the lobby, and approached Ava. The receptionist immediately assumed he was another visitor. What happened next surprised her. The man greeted Ava with obvious respect. They spoke quietly for less than a minute. Then he handed her a folder and asked, "Would you like me to reschedule the afternoon meetings?" Ava smiled politely. "Not yet. Let us give them a little more time." The man nodded without hesitation. "Of course." Then he left. The receptionist watched the entire exchange. Something about it felt different. This was not the way people spoke to someone who lacked influence. Across the lobby, Ethan noticed it too. His concern deepened. Upstairs, Richard Collins was finishing a meeting with regional partners. The discussion had gone well, reinforcing his confidence. As he walked toward his office, his executive assistant mentioned the waiting visitor again. Richard sighed. "She is still here?" "Yes," the assistant replied. "Nearly 3 hours now." Richard shook his head. "Anyone willing to wait that long clearly needs something from us." Then he continued walking. What he did not know was that the assumption was completely backward. Downstairs, Ava received another incoming call. This time she answered. Her voice remained calm and professional. Good afternoon, Michael. Ethan happened to be close enough to hear part of the conversation. The name immediately caught his attention. Michael Reynolds was one of the most respected investment leaders in the country. Ethan listened carefully. Ava spoke only briefly. I understand. Let us hold off until tomorrow. I am still evaluating a few things. After ending the call, she returned the phone to her portfolio. Ethan stared in disbelief. The possibility he had been considering suddenly felt much more real. For the first time all day, he stopped wondering whether the company had made a mistake. Instead, he began wondering how large that mistake was about to become. The clock on the lobby wall moved past noon, and for the first time that day, uncertainty began spreading through Collins' strategic group. It started quietly. A few employees who had noticed Ava earlier exchanged questions during lunch. Why was she still there? Why had nobody met with her? Why did she seem completely unconcerned about the delay? Most visitors became frustrated after 20 minutes. Some complained after 30. Ava had now waited almost 3 hours and carried herself as though time was not being wasted but measured. Ethan Parker returned to his desk and opened every internal record he could legally access. The deeper he searched, the more unusual the situation became. He found references to confidential strategy sessions involving major corporations, investment groups, and expansion projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ava Johnson's name appeared repeatedly, not as an assistant, not as a consultant, not as an observer. Her name appeared as a decision-maker. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Something was very wrong. He gathered several reports and headed toward the executive floor. This time he decided he could not ignore his concerns. Richard Collins was reviewing presentations for another meeting when Ethan knocked on the open office door. Do you have a minute? Ethan asked. Richard glanced up. Make it quick. Ethan carefully explained what he had discovered. He mentioned the internal references, the high-level meetings, and the unusual calls Ava had been receiving throughout the morning. Richard listened for less than 30 seconds before shaking his head. You are reading too much into it. Ethan hesitated. Sir, I think we should at least verify who she is. Richard stood and straightened his jacket. Ethan, successful leaders trust their judgment. If she were truly important, someone from our executive team would know about it already. With that, the conversation ended. Ethan left the office more concerned than before. Downstairs, the receptionist noticed something else. Every person who approached Ava treated her with respect. A delivery manager entered the building and greeted her by name. A business traveler stopped briefly to shake her hand. Another visitor recognized her and thanked her for advice she had given at an industry conference months earlier. None of these interactions lasted long, but together they created a pattern that was becoming difficult to ignore. Yet Ava never mentioned any of it. She never introduced herself. She never corrected anyone's assumptions. She simply remained patient. At 12:20 p.m., her phone vibrated again. This time she looked at the screen for several seconds before answering. Her voice was calm. Hello, Sandra. She listened carefully. No, do not make any changes yet. I want to see how today develops. After a pause, she smiled faintly. Yes, I understand the numbers. Let us wait a little longer. When the call ended, she placed the phone away and looked toward the elevators. Unknown to everyone around her, that brief conversation had involved a discussion about a major corporate partnership scheduled for final approval within the next 48 hours. A partnership that could dramatically impact the future of Collins' strategic group. And while Richard Collins continued believing he was evaluating a visitor, the reality was becoming increasingly clear. Someone else was quietly evaluating him. At 12:45 p.m., the atmosphere inside Collins' strategic group felt different, although nobody could quite explain why. The lobby remained calm, the elevators continued moving between floors, and meetings carried on as scheduled. Yet a quiet tension had begun to spread. More employees were noticing Ava Johnson. Some recognized her from business conferences. Others simply found it strange that someone could wait nearly 4 hours without showing the slightest sign of frustration. Ava remained exactly as she had been all morning. She sat with perfect composure, occasionally reviewing notes inside her portfolio and occasionally glancing toward the city beyond the rain-streaked windows. She neither demanded attention nor reminded anyone of her appointment. Her patience was becoming impossible to ignore. Upstairs, Richard Collins finished another executive meeting and felt satisfied with the day. Several promising opportunities were moving forward, and he believed his company was positioned for a strong quarter. As he entered his office, his chief financial officer, Daniel Mercer, appeared at the door. "Do you have a moment?" Daniel asked. Richard nodded. "What is it?" Daniel stepped inside carrying a tablet. "I wanted to discuss the Horizon Partnership Review." Richard immediately recognized the project. It represented one of the largest growth opportunities the company had pursued in years. The potential value extended far beyond immediate revenue and could influence the firm's future for the next decade. "What about it?" Richard asked. Daniel frowned slightly. "I still have not received final confirmation from the lead decision-maker." Richard looked unconcerned. "Give it time. These things always take longer than expected." Daniel hesitated. "Normally I would agree, but this situation feels different." Before Richard could respond, another executive entered the office and the conversation shifted to other matters. The topic was forgotten almost as quickly as it had appeared. Downstairs, Ethan Parker continued watching developments unfold. His instincts told him the company was overlooking something important. During the afternoon, he reviewed public records and industry reports. The more he searched, the more frequently Ava's name appeared. Yet every article revealed only part of the picture. It was as though someone had intentionally stayed out of the spotlight while quietly influencing major decisions behind the scenes. Ethan eventually returned to the lobby and noticed Ava speaking with an elderly maintenance employee who was replacing a ceiling panel nearby. Unlike many visitors, she treated him with genuine interest and respect. They spoke for several minutes. The man laughed, thanked her for the conversation, and walked away smiling. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Ava treated everyone the same way, regardless of position. Receptionist, maintenance worker, executive, or driver, it made no difference. Meanwhile, another message appeared on her phone. She read it carefully before typing a short response. Seconds later, a reply arrived. The subject line visible on the screen briefly caught Ethan's attention. It contained the words, "Board Approval Timeline." He could not see anything else, but it was enough to deepen his suspicion. By 1 p.m., nearly 4 hours after Ava had arrived, one fact had become increasingly clear. The woman waiting quietly in the lobby was connected to decisions far larger than anyone in the building realized. The only person who still seemed completely unaware of that reality was the man occupying the corner office on the top floor. At 1:15 p.m., the rain outside finally began to ease, but inside Collins' strategic group, the pressure was quietly building. Ava Johnson had now spent more than 4 hours in the lobby. The receptionist had stopped offering updates because there were none to give. Every explanation sounded weaker than the last. Yet Ava remained calm. She reviewed a few documents, answered an occasional message, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who never felt the need to prove her importance. Her composure was beginning to affect the people around her. Employees who had ignored her earlier now found themselves wondering who she really was. Ethan Parker could no longer shake the feeling that the company was heading toward a serious mistake. He returned to the internal database one more time and broadened his search. This time he discovered something he had not seen before. Several months earlier, senior executives had participated in a confidential planning session connected to the Horizon Partnership. The participant list was heavily restricted, but one name remained visible. Ava Johnson. Ethan stared at the screen. The meeting had involved only top-level decision-makers. Even more surprising, internal notes referred to one participant simply as primary stakeholder. The associated details had been redacted, but Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He immediately printed the record and headed toward the executive floor. Upstairs, Richard Collins was preparing for an afternoon presentation when Ethan arrived outside his office. This time Ethan did not intend to leave without being heard. After receiving permission to enter, he placed the document on Richard's desk. "I really think you need to look at this," he said. Richard glanced down briefly. "What am I looking at?" Ethan explained what he had found. Richard listened, but his expression remained unchanged. "A participant list does not tell us much." Ethan carefully chose his words. "Maybe not, but everything points in the same direction. She is connected to projects at the highest level. She has been receiving calls from major executives all day. Multiple people recognize her. I think we should verify exactly who she is before we continue treating her like an ordinary visitor." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Ethan, you are making assumptions based on incomplete information." Ethan wanted to argue, but he knew the conversation was over. As he left the office, frustration mixed with concern. Downstairs, another visitor entered the building and immediately spotted Ava. His face lit up with recognition. He approached her with a smile and shook her hand. "It is good to see you again," he said. "Congratulations on the Denver expansion." Ava thanked him politely. They exchanged a few words before he headed toward the elevators. Several employees witnessed the interaction. One quietly asked another, "How does everyone seem to know her?" Nobody had an answer. At 1:30 p.m. Ava's phone rang once more. This time she answered immediately. Her tone was professional but direct. "Yes, I have seen enough." She listened for several seconds before continuing. "No, do not finalize anything yet. I want to complete the evaluation first." After ending the call, she closed her portfolio and looked toward the executive elevators. For the first time all day, there was a subtle change in her expression. Not anger, not disappointment, simply a decision. And although nobody in the building realized it yet, the evaluation she referred to was not about a contract. It was about the people entrusted to lead the company that hoped to earn it. At 1:45 p.m. Events that had seemed unrelated throughout the day began moving toward a collision. Ava Johnson remained seated in the lobby, but she was no longer reviewing documents. Instead, she watched the activity around her with quiet attention. The receptionist noticed the change and felt unexpectedly nervous. For reasons she could not explain, it suddenly felt important that someone finally address the situation. Upstairs, a different kind of pressure was building. Daniel Mercer was reviewing financial projections connected to the Horizon Partnership when he received an email marked urgent. He opened it expecting routine updates. Instead, he found a message from an external advisory group requesting confirmation of executive readiness for final negotiations. One sentence immediately caught his attention. It referenced a pending evaluation from the lead stakeholder. Daniel frowned. The wording seemed unusual. He opened additional files and searched previous correspondence. Minutes later, his expression changed completely. The same phrase appeared repeatedly across multiple documents. Lead stakeholder. Final approval authority. Strategic review. Daniel continued reading until he reached a heavily summarized briefing prepared months earlier. Most names had been removed, but one remained visible due to a formatting error. Ava Johnson. Daniel sat motionless for several seconds. Then he stood up and walked quickly toward Richard Collins's office. This time he did not schedule a meeting. He entered immediately. Richard looked up from his desk. "What is so urgent?" Daniel placed the tablet in front of him. "I think we have a problem." Richard glanced at the screen. "What kind of problem?" Daniel pointed to the highlighted sections. Ava Johnson is not simply connected to the Horizon Partnership. Everything suggests she is the person responsible for the final recommendation. Richard looked unconvinced. "That does not mean she controls the decision." Daniel shook his head. "Maybe not alone, but she clearly has significant influence." Richard stared at the information longer than before. For the first time all day, uncertainty entered his expression. Before he could respond, his office phone rang. The caller was a senior board member. Richard answered confidently. Within moments, that confidence began to fade. The board member asked a simple question. "Has Ava Johnson arrived yet?" Richard hesitated. Why? There was a pause on the other end. Because everyone is waiting for her assessment before moving forward. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Assessment of what? The answer came immediately. Of us. Downstairs, Ava received another message. She read it, smiled faintly, and placed the phone back into her portfolio. Ethan Parker happened to see the expression. Unlike earlier messages, this one appeared to confirm something rather than request it. Around the lobby, conversations gradually quieted. People sensed that something important was happening, even if they did not know what. Then the receptionist received a call from the executive floor. Her eyes widened as she listened. When the call ended, she looked toward Ava with a mixture of surprise and concern. For the first time all day, she stood from behind her desk and walked directly toward her. "Ms. Johnson," she said carefully, "someone from upstairs would like to speak with you right away." Ava looked at her for a moment, then gently closed her portfolio. The waiting was over. The real meeting was finally about to begin. Ava Johnson rose from her chair with the same calm confidence she had carried throughout the day. She thanked the receptionist for letting her know and picked up her portfolio. As she walked toward the executive elevators, conversations in the lobby seemed to fade. Employees who had barely noticed her that morning now watched quietly. Some were curious. Others were concerned. A few were beginning to connect pieces that had not made sense before. Upstairs, Richard Collins stood near the conference room windows looking down at the city. For the first time that day, he was no longer certain of his own judgment. The conversation with the board member continued replaying in his mind. Everyone is waiting for her assessment. Of us. Those words were impossible to ignore. Daniel Mercer remained nearby reviewing additional documents. The more information they uncovered, the more uncomfortable the situation became. Several reports referenced private consultations with Ava. Others described her recommendations as highly influential in major investment decisions. One briefing summarized her reputation in a single sentence: trusted by leadership teams overseeing billions in assets. Richard read the line twice, then a third time. A knock interrupted the silence. The executive assistant opened the door. "Ms. Johnson is here." Richard immediately straightened his posture. "Please send her in." A few moments later, Ava entered the conference room. The atmosphere changed instantly. Not because she demanded attention. Not because she announced her credentials. Simply because she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in high-stakes environments. Richard stepped forward and extended his hand. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming. I apologize for the delays today." Ava shook his hand politely. "Thank you for meeting with me." Her tone revealed nothing. No irritation. No satisfaction. No sign that she intended to discuss the hours she had spent waiting downstairs. Richard gestured toward a chair. "Please have a seat." As the meeting began, Daniel watched carefully. He expected tension. Instead, Ava asked thoughtful questions about leadership, company culture, client relationships, and long-term strategy. The discussion felt less like a sales presentation and more like an evaluation. Richard gradually noticed the same thing. She was not trying to impress them. She was trying to understand them. 30 minutes into the conversation, Ava opened her portfolio and removed a thin folder. Inside were detailed notes. Richard immediately recognized information that had never been made public. Operational metrics, client retention patterns, leadership assessments, strategic observations. She knew far more about the company than he had imagined. "You have clearly done extensive research," Richard said carefully. Ava smiled. "Preparation is important when decisions carry long-term consequences." Then she slid a document across the table. Richard looked down and felt his pulse quicken. The first page displayed the logo of Horizon Capital Partners. Beneath it appeared a title identifying the lead strategic review committee. At the top of the list was Ava Johnson's name. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The room fell completely silent. Richard finally understood what Ethan had been trying to tell him. He finally understood why executives across the country seemed to know her. And most importantly, he finally understood that the woman who had spent hours waiting in his lobby was not seeking approval from his company. She was deciding whether his company deserved hers. Richard Collins slowly turned the document toward himself and studied the first page more carefully. The logo of Horizon Capital Partners was only the beginning. Attached behind it were committee records, strategic review summaries, and authorization letters. Every page confirmed the same reality. Ava Johnson was not merely participating in the evaluation process. She was leading it. Daniel Mercer leaned forward and reviewed the documents alongside Richard. The numbers alone were staggering. Horizon Capital Partners controlled investment decisions connected to projects valued at more than $500 million. Collins' strategic group had spent nearly 2 years positioning itself for an expanded partnership. Countless meetings had been held. Teams had worked weekends. Consultants had been hired. Forecasts had been prepared. Yet the person with the greatest influence over the final recommendation had spent nearly an entire business day waiting downstairs. Richard felt an uncomfortable weight settle in his chest. Throughout his career, he had built a reputation on reading people quickly. He often told younger executives that first impressions were among the most valuable tools in leadership. Now he found himself confronting the possibility that his confidence in those judgments had created one of the largest mistakes of his professional life. Across the table, Ava remained calm. She did not seem interested in making anyone uncomfortable. She simply allowed the facts to speak for themselves. After several moments, Richard finally broke the silence. "I was not aware of your role in the review process." Ava nodded politely. "I understand." Her response surprised him. There was no accusation, no criticism, only understanding. Somehow that made the situation feel even worse. Richard glanced through another document and discovered additional information he had never seen before. Horizon Capital Partners had narrowed its final evaluation to only 3 firms nationwide. Collins' strategic group was one of them. The decision was expected within days. Daniel looked up. "You have been conducting the final assessment yourself?" Ava smiled slightly. "Partly. Large partnerships involve more than financial projections. Numbers matter, but leadership matters too. Culture matters. How people are treated matters." Those words landed heavily in the room. Nobody needed further explanation. Everyone understood exactly what she meant. Richard looked toward the conference room windows. For the first time all day, he remembered the brief moment he had looked down into the lobby and dismissed the waiting visitor without a second thought. At the time, the decision had seemed insignificant. Now it appeared to reveal something far more important. Ava opened another folder and placed several pages on the table. These were not financial reports. They were evaluation categories: executive accessibility, organizational responsiveness, professional courtesy, respect for stakeholders. Richard immediately recognized what he was seeing. Collins' strategic group had been under review from the moment Ava entered the building. Every interaction had been part of the assessment. Every assumption had contributed to the outcome. Every hour she spent waiting had generated information. Daniel slowly exhaled. "You were evaluating us all day." Ava met his gaze. "Not intentionally at first. I arrived expecting a meeting. But once the situation developed, it became difficult to ignore what it revealed." The room fell silent again. Outside the conference room, employees continued moving through hallways unaware that one conversation was reshaping the future of the company. Inside, however, the balance of power had completely changed. The executives who believed they would be evaluating a potential partner now understood they had been the subjects of the evaluation from the very beginning. For several moments after Ava's explanation, nobody in the conference room spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable because of hostility. It was uncomfortable because everyone suddenly saw the day from a completely different perspective. Richard Collins looked down at the evaluation categories spread across the table. Professional courtesy, responsiveness, executive accessibility, stakeholder respect. The categories seemed simple at first glance, yet each one reflected something deeper than business performance. They measured character. They measured culture. They measured how an organization behaved when it believed nobody important was watching. Richard slowly folded his hands together. "Ms. Johnson, I owe you an apology." Ava listened respectfully but said nothing. Richard continued. "What happened today should not have happened. Regardless of your role, regardless of any partnership discussion, you deserved better treatment than what you experienced." Ava nodded politely. "I appreciate you saying that." Once again, there was no anger in her voice, no attempt to embarrass anyone. She simply acknowledged the statement and allowed the conversation to continue. Daniel Mercer observed the exchange carefully. The more Ava spoke, the more obvious it became why she held such influence. She was thoughtful, disciplined, and remarkably focused on long-term outcomes rather than personal emotions. Richard took a breath before asking the question that now mattered most. "Can I ask something directly?" Ava smiled slightly. "Of course." Richard glanced at the evaluation documents. "How much damage did today actually cause?" The room became very quiet. Ava considered the question before answering. "That depends on how you define damage." Richard waited. "From a business perspective, the concerns are manageable. Processes can be improved. Training can be improved. Communication can be improved." She paused briefly. "The more important issue is what today revealed." Daniel leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Ava looked toward both executives. "Nobody intended to be disrespectful. I understand that. But intention and impact are not always the same thing. Throughout the day, people made assumptions. Those assumptions influenced decisions. The longer the situation continued, the more opportunities there were to correct it. Yet nobody with authority stopped to ask whether those assumptions might be wrong." Her words were calm, but they carried tremendous weight. Richard immediately remembered Ethan Parker's warnings. He remembered his assistant's reminders. He remembered every moment he had dismissed concerns because he trusted his initial judgment. Ava continued, "Leadership is not measured when everything goes according to plan. Leadership is measured when unexpected situations appear. Those moments reveal how people think." Richard slowly nodded. For perhaps the first time in years, he found himself examining his own decisions without searching for excuses. The realization was uncomfortable but necessary. Meanwhile, outside the conference room, rumors had begun spreading throughout the building. Employees knew an important visitor had finally reached the executive floor. Some had heard references to Horizon Capital Partners. Others had noticed senior leaders moving with unusual urgency. Nobody knew the full story, but everyone sensed that the afternoon would be remembered for a long time. Back inside, Ava closed one of the folders and looked directly at Richard. "The reason I accepted this meeting was not because I wanted a perfect company. Perfect companies do not exist. I wanted to meet leaders who are willing to learn when mistakes happen." Richard met her gaze. In that moment, he realized the final outcome had not yet been decided. The evaluation was still happening, and what happened next might matter even more than everything that had already occurred. Richard Collins remained silent for several seconds after Ava's final comment. Throughout his career, he had become accustomed to defending decisions, explaining outcomes, and maintaining authority in difficult conversations. Yet this situation felt different. Every explanation he considered sounded weaker than the facts sitting on the conference table. The truth was simple. A visitor had arrived for an important meeting. Assumptions had been made. Opportunities to correct those assumptions had been ignored. And the result had exposed weaknesses that no financial report could reveal. Finally, Richard spoke. "If you were in my position, what would you do next?" The question surprised everyone in the room, including Daniel Mercer. It was not the kind of question Richard normally asked. Ava noticed that as well. She leaned back slightly and considered her answer. "I would start by asking who tried to solve the problem and who ignored it." Richard immediately thought about Ethan Parker. Multiple times during the day, Ethan had raised concerns. Multiple times, those concerns had been dismissed. Ava continued, "Organizations reveal themselves through small decisions. One person notices something unusual. Another person speaks up. Leadership chooses whether to listen. That process matters more than most people realize. Richard nodded slowly. The observation felt accurate. Daniel reviewed notes from earlier conversations and came to the same conclusion. The company had not lacked information. It had lacked curiosity. A few minutes later, Richard requested that Ethan Parker join the meeting. When Ethan entered the conference room, he immediately sensed the change in atmosphere. The documents on the table, the expressions around the room, and Ava's presence all confirmed that the truth had finally surfaced. Richard stood and addressed him directly. "You tried to warn us today." Ethan looked uncomfortable. "I was not completely sure. I just thought we should verify the situation." Richard nodded. "And you were right." For a moment, nobody spoke. Ethan had expected many possible outcomes from his concerns. Public acknowledgement from the chief executive officer was not one of them. Ava watched the exchange with interest. More than anything else she had seen that day, this moment revealed how leaders responded when confronted with mistakes. Richard turned toward Ava. "One of the things I am realizing is that we almost ignored our strongest signal." Ava smiled slightly. "Good organizations do not succeed because they avoid mistakes. They succeed because people feel safe enough to raise concerns before those mistakes grow larger." Ethan listened carefully. The lesson felt bigger than the partnership discussion itself. It applied to every decision, every department, and every level of leadership. The meeting continued for another hour. This time, the conversation focused less on contracts and more on culture. Ava asked thoughtful questions about hiring practices, employee feedback, leadership development, and accountability. Richard answered honestly. Sometimes the answers highlighted strengths. Sometimes they revealed weaknesses. Yet for the first time all day, nobody seemed interested in protecting appearances. They were focused on understanding reality. As the discussion came to a close, Ava gathered her documents and prepared to leave. Richard knew the final recommendation had not yet been announced. The future of the partnership remained uncertain. But one thing was already clear. The most important lesson of the day had nothing to do with money. It had come from a woman who never raised her voice, never demanded special treatment, and never used her influence to force respect. Instead, she had revealed something far more powerful. She had allowed people to reveal themselves. As the meeting concluded, Richard Collins walked Ava Johnson toward the executive elevators. The conversation remained professional, but the atmosphere was completely different from the one that had existed earlier that morning. What began as an overlooked appointment had become a turning point for everyone involved. Before entering the elevator, Ava shook hands with Richard, Daniel Mercer, and Ethan Parker. "Thank you for your time," she said. Richard nodded. "Thank you for your honesty." The elevator doors closed, and Ava disappeared from view. For several moments, nobody moved. Then Richard turned toward Ethan. "I want a full review of what happened today." Ethan looked surprised. "A review?" Richard nodded. "Not to assign blame, to understand how this happened and how we prevent it from happening again." Daniel agreed immediately. By late afternoon, several department leaders had gathered in a conference room. The discussion focused on process failures, communication gaps, and the assumptions that had shaped decisions throughout the day. What surprised many participants was how quickly the problem could have been solved. A simple verification, a single follow-up call, one decision to look deeper rather than rely on appearances. Any of those actions would have changed the outcome. Instead, small assumptions accumulated hour after hour until they became a major issue. Meanwhile, word of the situation quietly spread through the organization. Employees discussed the lessons among themselves. Some reflected on moments when they had made quick judgments about clients or visitors. Others thought about situations where they had hesitated to speak up. More than one employee approached Ethan privately to thank him for raising concerns when others had remained silent. 2 days later, an important message arrived from Horizon Capital Partners. Senior executives gathered in Richard's office to review it. Nobody knew what to expect. The evaluation process had been intense. The mistake had been significant. Yet the response afterward had been sincere. Richard opened the message and began reading. The letter acknowledged the events that had occurred during the visit. It referenced both the shortcomings that had been observed and the actions taken afterward. Several paragraphs described the company's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths rather than deny them. Finally, Richard reached the conclusion. Horizon Capital Partners would continue moving forward with partnership discussions. Relief spread across the room, but the message contained an important condition. Future collaboration would include leadership accountability benchmarks and cultural performance reviews. The opportunity remained alive, but expectations had become even higher. Richard lowered the document and sat quietly for a moment. The company had not escaped consequences. Instead, it had been given an opportunity to earn trust moving forward. Later that afternoon, Richard called Ethan into his office. "I wanted to thank you," he said. Ethan looked confused. "For what?" Richard smiled. "For doing what good professionals are supposed to do. You saw something that did not make sense. You asked questions. You kept asking even when it was uncomfortable." Ethan appreciated the words but knew the lesson applied to everyone. The events of that day had revealed weaknesses throughout the organization, not just in a single decision. As employees left the office that evening, the atmosphere felt different. The company still had the same clients, the same offices, and the same goals. Yet something important had changed. People had been reminded that respect should never depend on titles, appearances, or assumptions. Because sometimes the person sitting quietly in the lobby is not waiting to be judged. Sometimes they are the one doing the judging. Several months later, the story of that rainy Tuesday was still discussed inside Collins' strategic group, but not for the reason most people expected. It was not remembered because of a delayed meeting. It was not remembered because of a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was remembered because one ordinary day revealed extraordinary lessons about leadership, judgment, and respect. The partnership with Horizon Capital Partners eventually moved forward. The agreement created new opportunities for both organizations and opened doors that neither side could have achieved alone. Yet the most valuable outcome was not written into any contract. It was reflected in the changes that followed. Collins' strategic group introduced new protocols for handling visitors and stakeholders. Managers received additional leadership training. Employees were encouraged to raise concerns without fear of being ignored. Most importantly, the company began paying closer attention to how people were treated before their titles, positions, or influence became known. Richard Collins often reflected on the experience. For years, he had believed that leadership was primarily about making decisions. Now he understood that leadership was also about questioning assumptions. The strongest leaders were not those who always believed they were right. They were the ones willing to reconsider when evidence suggested otherwise. Ethan Parker continued advancing within the organization. His willingness to speak up became an example for others. New employees heard the story during leadership workshops, not because Ethan had discovered something extraordinary, but because he had done something simple. He paid attention when others stopped paying attention. He asked questions when others relied on assumptions. Ava Johnson remained exactly as she had always been. Her influence continued growing across the business world. She advised major organizations, guided strategic investments, and participated in decisions affecting billions of dollars in economic activity. Yet despite her success, people who worked with her often described the same quality above all others. She treated everyone with respect. Receptionists, assistants, executives, maintenance workers, new employees, industry leaders. It never seemed to matter who someone was or what position they held. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after the original meeting, Richard received a handwritten note from Ava. The message was brief. She thanked him for the honesty he had shown after recognizing the mistake. She also thanked him for choosing improvement over excuses. Richard kept the note in his desk drawer for years. Whenever difficult decisions arose, he occasionally reread it. Not because it reminded him of failure, but because it reminded him of growth. Looking back, Ava could have reacted differently. She could have left after the first hour. She could have used her influence to create embarrassment. She could have focused on punishment. Instead, she chose something more powerful. She allowed people the opportunity to learn from their actions. That choice transformed a disappointing experience into a lasting lesson. And perhaps that is why the events of that day continued to matter long after contracts were signed and meetings were forgotten. Because every person eventually encounters moments when assumptions seem easier than understanding. Moments when appearances seem more convincing than facts. Moments when quick judgments feel more convenient than genuine curiosity. The difference between failure and wisdom often comes down to what happens next. Some people defend their assumptions. Others learn from them. And in the end, the people who earn the greatest respect are rarely the loudest voices in the room. They are the ones who understand that every person deserves dignity long before anyone discovers their title, their influence, or the size of their success.